December 7, 1943. Outside the village of Trzeblawis in occupied Poland, snowflakes drifted through the air as Sergeant Franz Müller checked his orders for the third time that morning, convinced there must have been some mistake. He believed today would simply involve routine guard duty at the labor camp. Instead, he had been tasked with something that made his stomach turn to ice colder than the winter air around him. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a single moment of human connection in the midst of mankind's darkest hour would not only save one woman's life, but would ultimately transform two souls forever, proving that even in our bleakest moments, the power of individual conscience can illuminate paths we never imagined possible. For 26-year-old Franz Müller, winter in Poland represented his second year serving in the occupying forces. A former university student of architecture from Munich, Franz had been conscripted in 1941, his dreams of creating beautiful buildings replaced by military uniforms and strict orders. His brown hair was now cut military short, his once artistic hands calloused from weapon drills, and the thoughtful eyes that had once studied building designs now constantly scanned his surroundings with the wariness of a soldier in hostile territory. Franz had managed thus far to avoid the worst assignments. Through a combination of administrative skills and a family connection to a mid-ranking officer, he had secured positions that mostly kept him away from the most troubling aspects of the occupation. He processed papers, managed supply logistics, and occasionally supervised work details. This distance had allowed him to maintain a fragile internal fiction, that he was simply a soldier doing his duty, not participating in anything that violated his increasingly buried moral compass. That morning changed everything. The orders came directly from Hauptmann Dieter Brenner, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable. The orders were clear and without euphemism. A group of prisoners had been caught attempting to escape. 5 had been recaptured. 4 had already been dealt with as an example to the others. The 5th, a woman, was being held separately due to information she might possess about resistance contacts. Franz was to interrogate her and then carry out the final sentence. "This is a test of your commitment, Müller," Brenner had said, his cold grey eyes evaluating Franz's reaction. "You've been too long behind a desk. Field officers must be willing to do what is necessary." Franz had managed to maintain his composure, but as he walked toward the detention building, the paper in his hand felt as though it weighed 100 kilos. The detention building was a converted storage facility on the edge of the camp perimeter, isolated enough that what happened inside wouldn't disturb the camp's routine operations. Franz dismissed the 2 guards outside with a curt nod, his expression carefully neutral until they were out of sight. Then he paused, drew a deep breath of the freezing air, and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled of damp concrete and fear. In the center of the room sat a woman on a wooden chair, her hands bound behind her back. She wore the striped uniform of the labor camp, now dirty and torn in places. Despite this, she sat with a strange dignity, her back straight, her gaze directed forward. When the door opened, she didn't flinch or turn. Only when Franz moved directly into her line of sight did her eyes meet his. Those eyes struck him immediately, dark brown, almost black in the poor light, and completely devoid of the fear he expected to see. Instead, they held a quiet defiance and something else he couldn't immediately identify. Perhaps resignation, perhaps acceptance, but certainly not terror. "I am Sergeant Müller," Franz said in Polish that he had learned during his time in the occupation. "I have some questions for you." "My name is Sarah Abramowitsch," she replied in nearly perfect German, surprising him. "I have already answered all questions yesterday and the day before. I have nothing more to say." Franz was taken aback both by her command of his language and her calm demeanor. Most prisoners would be pleading or trembling by now. He consulted the sparse file that had been provided to him. Sarah Abramowitsch, 24 years old, captured during an escape attempt with 4 others. Former university student in Warsaw, studying literature before the war. Suspected connections to resistance networks. No other information was provided. "You speak excellent German," Franz remarked, unsure why he was making conversation rather than beginning the interrogation. "I studied German literature at the university," she replied simply. "Goethe, Schiller, Heine," before your people closed it down. Franz felt a strange connection at the mention of university studies. "I was a student too," he said before catching himself. This was not how an interrogation was meant to proceed. He cleared his throat. "You were caught attempting to escape with 4 others. You know what happened to them." It wasn't a question, but she nodded once, her eyes momentarily closing. "The camp authorities believe you have information about resistance contacts outside the camp, names, locations, future operations. This is your final opportunity to provide that information." Sarah's eyes opened again, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "There were no contacts," she said evenly. "We planned it ourselves over many months. We failed, that is all." "You must understand your situation," Franz insisted, lowering his voice. "If you don't provide the information they want, then you will kill me as you killed my friends," she finished for him, her voice somehow remaining steady. "I understand perfectly." Franz felt a cold weight settling in his chest. How had he arrived at this moment? How had the architecture student from Munich become this man in this room with these orders? "Why were you separated from the others?" he asked, deviating from the prescribed interrogation. A small, bitter smile touched her lips. "The officer in charge, Brenner, I believe, thought a woman would be easier to break, that I would be so grateful for a few extra hours of life, that I would betray everyone and everything." The smile faded. He was wrong. Franz moved away from her, pacing the small room. The file in his hand contained the bare minimum of information. If there was evidence of her connection to resistance networks, it wasn't included. This began to strike him as odd. Either Brenner was testing him, as suggested earlier, or there was no actual intelligence to be gained here. "Where did you study in Warsaw?" he asked suddenly. The question clearly surprised her. "The University of Warsaw, Department of Philology." "And what was your favorite German work that you studied?" She hesitated, clearly trying to understand the purpose of this line of questioning. "Nathan der Weise," she finally answered. "Lessing's Nathan the Wise." Franz nodded, the title immediately resonating with him. Lessing's play about religious tolerance, about a wise Jewish man who teaches that all religions should live in brotherhood. The irony of her answer in their current situation was overwhelming. A story about wisdom and humanity, transcending religious differences, he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed, watching him carefully. "The parable of the 3 rings. The idea that we are all God's children, regardless of how we worship." Franz suddenly felt as though he couldn't breathe properly in the small room. The disconnect between the discussion of Enlightenment literature and what he had been ordered to do was too stark, too obscene. He walked to the door and opened it slightly, letting in cold, fresh air, confirming they were still alone. When he turned back, Sarah was watching him with that same penetrating gaze. "You're not like the others," she said softly. "You don't know me," Franz responded sharply. "I know you haven't struck me. I know you're asking about literature instead of shouting threats." "I know your hands are trembling." Franz looked down and realized she was right. He clenched his hands into fists to stop the shaking. "What will you do, Sergeant Müller?" she asked. It was the question he had been asking himself since receiving the orders. What would he do? What could he do? Brenner would be expecting a report. The other escaped prisoners had been executed. If Sarah wasn't as well, questions would be asked. His own fate would be sealed alongside hers. "Tell me about your family," he said, the words coming out before he had fully formed the thought. Sarah's composure wavered for the first time. "Why?" "Please," Franz said, "tell me." She took a deep breath. "My father was a watchmaker in Warsaw. My mother taught music. I have a younger brother, Simon. He was 16 when we were separated at the beginning of the occupation. I don't know where any of them are now." As she spoke, Franz saw not a prisoner or an enemy, but a young woman not so different from his own sister back in Munich. Someone with a family, a past, hopes that had been crushed by the war. "And you?" she asked unexpectedly. "Do you have family waiting for you?" Franz hesitated, but then found himself answering. "My parents in Munich, My father works at a bank. My mother is a housewife. I have a sister, Elise, who is studying to be a nurse. The words felt strange, sharing personal details with a prisoner he was supposed to execute. Sarah nodded slowly. Do they know what you do here? The question hit him like a physical blow. No, he whispered. They think I'm helping to maintain order, to rebuild. That's what the letters say. And is that what you believe you're doing? Franz didn't answer, couldn't answer. Instead, he walked to the small table in the corner where a canteen of water sat. He poured some into a tin cup and brought it to her. May I? He asked, gesturing to her bound hands. She nodded, and he moved behind her chair, untying the rough rope that secured her wrists. When she was free, she rubbed her chafed skin before accepting the water cup with both hands. Thank you, she said, her eyes never leaving his face as she drank. Franz knew he was crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. By untying her, by treating her with basic humanity, he was already disobeying orders. But the momentum of this realization carried him forward rather than pulling him back. The labor camp has records of prisoners transferred to other locations, he said in a low voice. I could check if there's any information about your family. Hope flickered in her eyes before caution tamped it down. Why would you do that? Franz had no ready answer. Why indeed? What was he doing? What was he contemplating? The consequences would be severe, possibly fatal, and yet the alternative, carrying out his orders, now seemed impossible. I don't know, he admitted. I just know I can't do what they've asked of me. Sarah set the empty cup down on the floor. What happens if you don't? Someone else will, Franz replied grimly. Brenner will simply assign another soldier, and he'll likely punish me as well. They sat in silence for a long moment, the reality of their situation hanging heavy between them. There might be a way, Franz finally said, the outline of a plan forming in his mind. It was desperate, dangerous, and depended on too many variables he couldn't control, but it was the only alternative to the unthinkable. But you would have to trust me completely, and I don't know why you would. Sarah studied him intently. What way? Franz explained his half-formed plan, speaking quickly and quietly. The camp maintained records of prisoner executions, but verification was often cursory, especially in winter when bodies were harder to process. With the right paperwork and timing, he might be able to report her execution while actually helping her escape. Where would I go? Sarah asked, practical even in this moment of desperate planning. There's a forester's cabin about 8 kilometers north of here, Franz said. It's abandoned now. I discovered it during a patrol last month. You could hide there while I try to arrange something more permanent. Why? Sarah asked again, more insistently this time. Why would you risk everything for a stranger? For someone like me? Franz looked away, unable to meet her penetrating gaze. Because I can't be part of this anymore. Because when I joined the army, I thought I was serving my country, not... He trailed off, the words sticking in his throat. Not becoming a murderer. Sarah finished for him. Franz nodded, the blunt truth of her words stripping away the last of his rationalizations. That was exactly what he had been asked to become, what so many around him had already become. I don't know if this will work, he warned her. The chances are. Better than the alternative, Sarah completed his thought again. I'll trust you, Sergeant Müller. Not because I have a choice, but because I believe you still have a conscience. I see it in your eyes. As the pale winter sun began to set outside, Franz set his plan in motion. He carefully replaced the rope around Sarah's wrists, loose enough that she could free herself when the time came. He wrote out the execution report with a shaking hand, recording the official time of death as 8 o'clock that evening. When the night shift begins at 7, there's a 30-minute gap in the perimeter patrol on the north side, he told her in a whisper. I'll come for you then. Be ready. The next few hours were the longest of Franz's life. He performed his regular duties with mechanical precision while his mind raced through contingency plans, possible failures, and the consequences of what he was about to do. He secured a small pack with rations, a blanket, and a map, hiding it in a storage shed near the perimeter fence. Just before 7, he made his way back to the detention building, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain others could hear it. The night was fully dark now, and a light snow had begun to fall again, which Franz hoped would cover their tracks. The guards changing shifts barely acknowledged him as he approached the building. Franz had cultivated a reputation for efficiency and by-the-book discipline that served him well now. No one questioned why he was handling this matter personally. Inside the building, Sarah sat exactly as he had left her. When the door closed behind him, her eyes sought his, questioning. "It's time," he said simply, moving behind her to properly untie her bonds. "The report is filed. As far as the camp administration is concerned, you've already been executed." Sarah stood, rubbing her wrists. "And my body, recorded as processed with the others from your group." Franz handed her a heavy wool coat he had brought. "Put this on. If anyone sees us from a distance, you'll look like a soldier." She slipped the coat on, instantly disappearing in its oversized dimensions. Franz reached into his pocket and withdrew a small pistol, which he handed to her grip first. Sarah stared at it in shock. "I don't understand." "Insurance," Franz said grimly. "If we're caught, use it on me first, then yourself. Better than the alternative." Sarah reluctantly took the weapon, handling it as though it might burn her. "Have you done this before, helped someone escape?" Franz shook his head. "Never, but I've been complicit through inaction for too long. That ends tonight." He checked his watch. 7:15. The patrol gap would begin in 15 minutes. They needed to move. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "Walk like a soldier, confident, purposeful. If I tell you to run, don't argue. Just run north toward the tree line. The cabin is about 8 kilometers directly north, near a small stream. Can you find your way by the stars?" Sarah nodded. "My father taught me." "Good." Franz took a deep breath. "Let's go." They stepped out into the snowy night. Franz led the way, walking at a deliberate pace that suggested routine rather than escape. They passed the administrative building, now mostly dark except for a few windows where officers were working late. Franz nodded to another soldier they passed, who barely glanced at Sarah in her oversized coat. As they approached the northern perimeter, Franz could feel the tension radiating from Sarah, despite her outward composure. The weight of what they were doing, what he was doing, threatened to overwhelm him. He was betraying his oath, risking his life, and potentially endangering his family back home. And yet each step felt more right than anything he had done since arriving in Poland. They reached the storage shed, where Franz had hidden the supplies. He quickly retrieved the pack and handed it to Sarah. "There's food for about 5 days, a blanket, matches, and a map. The cabin is marked." He pointed north. "Stay off roads and away from villages. There's a resistance network operating in this area. If you can make contact with them." "I'll find them," Sarah said with quiet confidence. "What about you? Won't they suspect you helped me?" Franz shook his head. "The report is filed. As long as no one sees us now, there's no reason to suspect anything other than administrative oversight." He didn't mention his greater fear, that Brenner had set this up specifically to test his loyalty, and that the commander was already aware of what was happening. They continued toward the perimeter fence. In the distance, Franz could see the lights of the guard towers, but the section they were approaching was momentarily unmonitored, as he had planned. The snow was falling more heavily now, obscuring visibility, another stroke of luck. When they reached the fence, Franz quickly cut through the wire with cutters he had taken from maintenance. The opening was small, but enough for a person to squeeze through. "This is it," he said, turning to Sarah. "Once you're through, run for the trees and don't look back." Sarah stood before him, snowflakes catching in her dark hair, her face pale in the moonlight. For a moment neither of them moved or spoke. Then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold, but her grip surprisingly strong. "I won't forget what you did tonight, Franz Müller. Whatever happens, a part of you will always be free because of this choice." Franz felt something crack inside him, some final barrier between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. "Find your family," he whispered. "Live." Sarah squeezed his hand once more, then released it. She moved to the fence opening, dropping to her knees to squeeze through the gap. Once on the other side, she looked back at Franz one last time, her expression a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that he couldn't name. Then she was gone, disappearing into the swirling snow and the darkness beyond. Franz quickly adjusted the cut wire to make the opening less obvious, knowing it would be discovered eventually, but hoping the snow would conceal it until morning at least. Then he made his way back through the camp, his heart still racing but his mind strangely calm. He had crossed a line tonight from which there was no return, yet he felt no regret, only a curious sense of peace amidst the danger. Back in his quarters, he lay awake all night, imagining Sarah making her way through the forest, wondering if she would reach the cabin safely, if she would find resistance contacts, if she would survive. He knew he would likely never know her fate. For her safety and his, their paths could never cross again. As dawn broke, Franz prepared himself for the day ahead, for the moment when Sarah's escape might be discovered. He had his story ready. The execution had been carried out as ordered, the paperwork filed. Any suggestion otherwise would be met with calm denial. Whether it would be enough, he couldn't know. 3 days passed without incident. Franz performed his duties with the same efficiency as always, though inside he felt fundamentally changed. Each time he passed the detention building, each time he saw Brenner across the campgrounds, he expected to be seized, questioned, punished. But nothing happened. The escape remained undiscovered, or at least unattributed to him. On the 4th day, Franz was called to Brenner's office. His heart froze, but he maintained his composure as he reported as ordered. Hauptmann Brenner was seated behind his desk, reviewing documents. Without looking up, he gestured for Franz to sit. "Sergeant Müller," Brenner finally said, setting down the papers and fixing Franz with his cold grey eyes. "Your execution report on the female prisoner from last week." Franz felt ice spreading through his veins, but kept his expression neutral. "Yes, Hauptmann?" "It was filed correctly, but you failed to include the witness signatures." Brenner pushed a document across the desk. "Administrative oversights create questions, Müller. Questions create investigations. Investigations take valuable time away from the war effort. Do you understand?" Relief washed over Franz, quickly replaced by renewed caution. "Yes, sir, I apologize for the oversight." "See that it doesn't happen again." Brenner studied him for a moment longer. "The prisoner. Did she provide any useful information before the execution?" Franz met Brenner's gaze steadily. "No, sir, she maintained there were no outside contacts for the escape attempt." "I see." Brenner nodded slowly. "And the execution itself? Was it carried out properly?" There was something in Brenner's tone that made Franz wonder if the commander suspected something, but he had committed to this course, and there was no turning back. "Yes, sir, according to regulations." Brenner continued to study him, and Franz had the uncomfortable feeling that the man could see straight through to his deception. Then, unexpectedly, Brenner smiled slightly. "Good. That will be all, Sergeant." Franz saluted and left the office, his uniform damp with cold sweat despite the winter chill. Had he passed some test, or was Brenner simply toying with him, waiting for the right moment to spring a trap? There was no way to know. In the weeks that followed, Franz found himself changed in ways both subtle and profound. He performed his duties with the same outward precision, but inside, a quiet rebellion had taken root. He began to notice things he had previously forced himself to ignore: the hollow eyes of the prisoners, the casual cruelty of certain guards, the machinery of dehumanization that operated all around him, and when possible, in small ways that wouldn't draw attention, he began to subvert that machinery. Extra rations slipped to the weakest prisoners, work assignments adjusted to spare the elderly or ill from the hardest labor, medical supplies miscounted and diverted to the prisoner infirmary. None of these acts would save lives the way he had saved Sarah's, but each was a tiny affirmation of the choice he had made that night. Franz also began gathering information: camp transfer records, train schedules, lists of other facilities. He told himself it was in case he ever had another opportunity to help someone escape. But in truth, he was looking for any mention of Sarah's family, her watchmaker father, her music teacher mother, her younger brother Simon. It was a futile search, he knew, like looking for specific droplets in a vast ocean. But it gave purpose to his days. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. The war continued, though rumors of Allied advances began to circulate, even among the German ranks. Franz received a promotion to Oberfeldwebel, which gave him more administrative authority and, ironically, more ability to continue his small acts of sabotage. In August, orders came that the camp would be evacuated. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and all personnel and prisoners would be relocated westward. The chaos of preparations gave Franz unprecedented access to records, and in a moment that seemed like divine intervention, he found what he had been searching for: a transfer record for one Simon Abramovich, age 18, sent to a labor camp near the German border in 1942. It wasn't much. No mention of the parents, no guarantee that this Simon was Sarah's brother, no certainty that the young man was still alive a year later. But it was something. Franz memorized the details, hoping against hope that somehow, someday, he might pass this information to Sarah, or use it to help her family if he ever located them. The evacuation was a nightmare of logistics and human suffering. Prisoners too weak to travel were dealt with in ways that Franz couldn't bear to witness. Those who could walk were formed into columns for the westward march. Franz volunteered to oversee the records transfer, partly to ensure the information about Simon Abramovich wasn't lost, partly to avoid participating directly in the evacuation's darker aspects. As German forces retreated and the Allied armies advanced from both east and west, the military structure began to fragment. Units were separated, command chains broken, and in the chaos, Franz saw his opportunity. During a night march through a heavily forested area, he simply walked away from his unit, taking with him only his identification papers, a small amount of food, and the precious record mentioning Simon Abramovich. Franz was now a deserter, subject to execution if caught by German forces, and a former camp officer, subject to arrest if captured by the Allies. He moved west, avoiding main roads and population centers, working when necessary on isolated farms where questions weren't asked. His goal was to reach his family in Munich, though he had no illusions about the reception he might receive. Germany was losing the war, and those who had served in the East carried a stigma that would only intensify as the full truth of the occupation emerged. By early 1945, Franz had made it as far as eastern Germany. The country was in chaos, with refugees streaming westward ahead of the Soviet advance, Allied bombing reducing cities to rubble, and the remnants of the German military attempting to maintain order while retreating on all fronts. Franz found himself caught in this maelstrom, his status as a deserter forcing him to live in the shadows, constantly alert to the danger of discovery. In April, sheltering in a barn outside Dresden, Franz heard from fellow refugees that Hitler was dead and Berlin had fallen. The war was effectively over, though fighting continued in pockets. The news brought no joy, only a grim satisfaction that the madness was finally ending, and a deep apprehension about what would follow. Munich, when Franz finally reached it in June, was a city transformed. Allied bombing had left entire neighborhoods in ruins. Food was scarce, the population swollen with refugees, and American military government had replaced Nazi administration. Franz's family home in the Schwabing district had survived relatively intact, though a nearby bombing had shattered all its windows and left deep cracks in the walls. The reunion with his parents and sister was complex and emotional. They welcomed their son home with tears and embraces, but when Franz tried to explain where he had been and what he had seen, being careful to omit his desertion and his role in Sarah's escape, his father grew silent, his mother distressed. Only Elise, his nurse sister who had served in a military hospital, seemed capable of hearing even a sanitized version of the truth. "Enough, Franz," his father finally said during one such conversation. "The war is over. Germany must rebuild. Looking backward helps no one." But Franz couldn't stop looking backward. The faces of the camp prisoners haunted his dreams, and always there was Sarah, her dignity in that detention room, her trust in him despite everything, her final words to him before disappearing into the snowy night. Had she survived? Had she found resistance contacts? Had the information about her brother ever reached her? In the immediate post-war period, such questions had to be set aside in favor of basic survival. Franz found work as a translator for the American occupation forces, his university English, proving valuable in the new order. He registered with the Red Cross and other organizations, searching for displaced persons, providing Simon Abramovich's information, and asking to be notified if either Simon or Sarah was found. But with millions displaced, families separated, and records destroyed, he held little hope for success. Months passed, then years. Germany began the long process of rebuilding, physically and psychologically. Franz eventually returned to university to complete his architecture degree, specializing in reconstruction projects. The work was meaningful, bringing beauty and function back to damaged cities, but a part of him remained locked in that detention room in Poland, forever making the choice to cut the fence, to help Sarah escape, to reclaim his humanity. In 1948, Franz received a letter from a displaced persons organization. They had no information about Sarah or Simon Abramovich, but requested his help with translation work for Jewish survivors seeking to emigrate to Palestine, now newly established as the State of Israel. Franz volunteered immediately, partly out of genuine desire to help, partly out of a lingering hope that he might discover some trace of Sarah among the émigrés. The work brought Franz into contact with survivors from camps far worse than the labor camp where he had served. Their stories both horrified him and confirmed his belief that helping Sarah escape had been the only moral choice possible. He worked tirelessly, using his language skills and his knowledge of bureaucracy to help cut through red tape and expedite emigration paperwork. It was during this work, in early 1949, that Franz received another letter, this one from a relocation coordinator in the American zone of occupied Germany. A man named Simon Abramovich had been located in a displaced persons camp near Stuttgart. He was seeking information about his family, particularly his sister Sarah. Franz requested emergency leave from his regular job and traveled to Stuttgart immediately. The displaced persons camp was a collection of simple barracks housing thousands of survivors waiting for visas to Palestine, the United States, or elsewhere. Finding Simon Abramovich in this sea of humanity would have been impossible without the help of camp administrators. When Franz was finally led to the correct barracks, his heart pounded with an emotion he couldn't name. A young man sat on a cot, perhaps 22 years old, thin but healthier than many of the survivors. He had dark hair and eyes that immediately reminded Franz of Sarah. "Simon Abramovich?" Franz asked hesitantly. The young man looked up, wariness in his expression. "Yes? Who are you?" Franz hesitated. How could he explain who he was, what he had done, why he was here? "My name is Franz Müller. I met your sister Sarah during the war." Simon was on his feet instantly, gripping Franz's arm with surprising strength. "Sarah, she's alive, you've seen her?" The hope in his voice was painful to hear. Franz carefully extracted himself from Simon's grip and sat down on the adjacent cot, gesturing for Simon to do the same. "I last saw her in December 1943, Franz said slowly. "She was a prisoner in a labor camp where I was stationed as a guard." He paused, watching Simon's expression shift from hope to suspicion. "I helped her escape." Simon's eyes widened in disbelief. "You, a German soldier? Why would you do that?" Franz looked down at his hands. "Because they ordered me to kill her, and I couldn't do it." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of Franz's life. He explained the circumstances of meeting Sarah, their brief connection over German literature, his decision to help her escape, and the information he had later discovered about Simon's whereabouts. He did not speak of his other actions at the camp, either before or after Sarah's escape, but he didn't hide his role in the occupation. When Franz finished, Simon sat in silence for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "So you don't know if she survived after escaping?" he finally said. "No," Franz admitted. "There was a forester's cabin where she could shelter initially, and resistance groups in the area she might have contacted. But after that, I couldn't search for her without raising suspicions." Simon nodded slowly. "Our parents are gone. They were taken to a different camp almost immediately after we arrived. I never saw them again." He paused. "Sarah was always the strong one. Even before the war, she was the one who knew what to do, who had plans. If anyone could survive, it would be her." "The Red Cross has her registered as missing," as Franz said, "but their records are incomplete. Many survivors haven't registered, especially those who made their way east." "Why are you looking for her now?" Simon asked abruptly. "After all this time?" Franz considered the question carefully. Because I need to know if I actually helped her or just gave her false hope and a different kind of death. Because I promised her she would live. Because what happened that night changed everything for me. Simon studied Franz intently, much as Sarah had in that detention room years before. I should hate you, he said simply. You were one of them. Yes, Franz acknowledged. I was. But if what you say is true, you saved my sister when you could have killed her. Yes, Simon sighed, suddenly looking much older than his years. I don't know if I can forgive what your people did to my people. But if Sarah could trust you that night, perhaps I can trust you now. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I received this 2 months ago through a survivor network. I haven't had the means to respond or to travel. Franz took the paper with trembling hands. It was a brief note. The handwriting cramped and uneven, the paper thin and cheap. But the words leapt out at him. Simon, I am alive. If you receive this, I am in Paris with the Rosenberg family, Rue des Rosiers. I pray every day that you will see this message. Your loving sister, Sarah. Franz looked up at Simon, his vision blurring. She's alive, he whispered. So it seems, Simon replied, a cautious smile finally appearing on his face. But Paris might as well be the moon for someone like me. No passport, no money, no way to get there or even to send a message back. In that moment, Franz saw the path forward with perfect clarity. I can help, he said. I work with the immigration authorities. I can expedite your paperwork for a travel permit, and I have savings enough for 2 train tickets to Paris. Simon's expression hardened again. And why would you do that? What do you want in return? Nothing, Franz said honestly. Or perhaps everything. The chance to know that Sarah truly survived. The opportunity to complete what I started that night. The possibility of forgiveness, though I have no right to expect it. 3 weeks later, Franz and Simon sat side by side on a train bound for Paris. The journey had not been simple. Permission for a German national to travel to France so soon after the war, especially one with Franz's military background, had required calling in several favors. But his work with displaced persons had earned him allies in the occupation administration, and eventually the paperwork had been approved. Simon had been wary of Franz throughout the preparations, accepting his help, but maintaining an emotional distance that Franz fully understood. They were unlikely companions, the former German soldier and the Jewish survivor, bound together only by their connection to Sarah and the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this moment. As the train crossed the border into France, Simon broke a long silence. What will you say to her if we find her? Franz had asked himself the same question countless times. I don't know, he admitted. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it's better if I simply see that she's safe, and then leave you both to rebuild your lives. Simon considered this. That should be her choice, I think, not yours. Paris was emerging from the shadow of occupation, rebuilding like Germany, but without the burden of guilt and division. The Rue des Rosiers was in the heart of the city's Jewish quarter, a narrow street lined with small shops and apartment buildings. The Rosenberg family, they discovered, operated a small bakery with living quarters above. Standing outside the bakery, Franz felt a moment of panic. What right did he have to intrude on Sarah's new life? What if his presence brought back only trauma and pain? Simon seemed to sense his hesitation. Wait here, he said, touching Franz's arm briefly. Let me go first. Franz nodded gratefully, stepping back to watch as Simon entered the bakery. Through the window, he could see an older couple behind the counter, the Rosenbergs presumably, their expressions shifting from polite shopkeeper smiles to shock as Simon introduced himself. There was a flurry of activity, someone running toward the back of the shop, and then Sarah. Even from a distance through glass, Franz recognized her immediately. Her hair was longer now, her face less gaunt, but her bearing, that same dignity he had witnessed in the detention room, was unmistakable. She froze when she saw Simon, one hand flying to her mouth, and then they were embracing, both in tears, the Rosenbergs looking on with joyful expressions. Franz stood rooted to the spot, unable to move closer, unwilling to move away. He had his answer now. Sarah had survived. She was safe. His choice that snowy night had mattered. Perhaps that could be enough. He was about to turn away when Sarah happened to glance toward the window. Their eyes met across the distance, and Franz saw the moment of recognition dawn on her face. She said something quickly to Simon, who turned to look outside as well. Then Sarah was moving, pushing through the bakery door, stepping out onto the street. She stopped a few paces from Franz, her dark eyes wide and incredulous. "Sergeant Miller," she said softly. "Not anymore," Franz replied. "Just Franz now." "Franz," she repeated, as if testing the sound of his given name. "Simon told me you helped him find me, that you brought him here." Franz nodded. "I found a record of his transfer during the camp evacuation. After the war, I registered his information with various organizations. When he was located, it seemed right to help him reach you." Sarah studied him with the same penetrating gaze he remembered, though now there was something else in her expression. Not the defiance of their first meeting, but a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't fully interpret. "You look different out of uniform," she observed. "I feel different out of uniform." A small smile touched her lips. "I always wondered if you survived the war, if you had been caught helping me." "I wasn't," Franz said, "though there were moments when I thought Brenner suspected something." "You risked everything that night." Franz shook his head. "You were the one facing real danger. I just found my conscience." Sarah took a step closer. "In the years since, I've told the story many times. The German sergeant who chose humanity over orders. Few believed me. Some said I was naive, that you must have had other motives. Others said no German in that position would have helped a Jewish prisoner." "I understand their doubt," Franz replied. "After everything that happened, I might not believe it either." Sarah was silent for a moment. Then unexpectedly she reached out and took his hand, much as she had done that night before slipping through the fence. "But I knew. I saw the change in your eyes in that room, the moment when you couldn't be part of it anymore." Franz felt a tightness in his chest, emotions he had suppressed for years threatening to overflow. "I've wondered every day if you survived, if I had actually helped you or just sentenced you to a different kind of death." "I made it to the cabin," Sarah said. "Stayed there 3 days until I could make contact with local farmers connected to the resistance. They got me false papers, moved me east as the front advanced. Eventually I reached France. Found distant relatives of my mother, the Rosenbergs." She hesitated, then continued. "It wasn't easy. There were close calls, moments when I thought I wouldn't survive, but each time I remembered what you said. Find your family. Live. So I did." Franz couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the reality of her standing before him, alive and whole. Behind her, Simon had emerged from the bakery and was watching their interaction with a complex expression. "Will you come inside?" Sarah asked. "Meet the Rosenbergs? Have something to eat. They make the best bread in Paris." Franz glanced at Simon, uncertain. "I don't want to intrude on your reunion with your brother." "You're part of our story now," Sarah said simply. "Please." Inside the small bakery, over fresh bread and strong coffee, Franz listened as Sarah and Simon filled in the gaps of their respective war experiences. The Rosenbergs, distant cousins of their mother who had emigrated to France before the war, contributed their own stories of surviving in Paris during the German occupation. There was pain in these narratives, loss and suffering that Franz could acknowledge but never truly understand. And there was his own uncomfortable role, not as their persecutor, but as part of the system that had persecuted them. No single act of conscience could erase that reality. Yet, as the afternoon stretched into evening, Franz began to sense something unexpected developing. Not forgiveness exactly, which he had no right to ask for, but perhaps understanding. A recognition that in the darkest moments individual choices still mattered, that humanity could assert itself even within systems designed to destroy it. The Rosenbergs insisted Franz stay for dinner, and afterward, Sarah suggested a walk along the Seine. Simon elected to remain behind, giving his sister and the German who had saved her time to talk privately. As they walked along the river, Paris glowing in the evening light around them, Sarah spoke of her plans. She was teaching literature at a small school, helping refugee children adjust to life in France. Simon, she hoped, Would stay in Paris too, perhaps working in the bakery until he decided on a longer-term path. "And you?" she asked Franz. "What will you do when you return to Germany?" Franz had been thinking about this question throughout their evening together. "I've been helping with reconstruction projects, using my architecture training. It's meaningful work, rebuilding what was destroyed." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Creating instead of destroying, building instead of tearing down." "Yes," Franz agreed, "though it feels inadequate sometimes, compared to the scale of what was lost." They stopped, leaning against a stone wall overlooking the river. The lights of Paris reflected in the dark water, beautiful despite the lingering war damage visible in parts of the city. "You know," Sarah said after a moment, "in Jewish tradition, there's a concept called tikkun olam. It means repairing the world. The idea is that we all have a responsibility to heal the brokenness around us, to make the world more just, more whole." Franz considered this. Repairing the world. I like that idea. It acknowledges the damage without surrendering to despair. "Exactly," Sarah smiled. "That night in the detention room when you made your choice, you were practicing tikkun olam, though you wouldn't have called it that. You were repairing a small piece of a very broken world." Franz was quiet for a long moment, watching the play of light on water. "I've never told anyone the full story of that night," he finally said. "Not my family, not my colleagues. There was never anyone who could truly understand what it meant. And now," Sarah asked softly. "Now I've found the one person who was there," Franz replied, "who knows exactly what happened and what was at stake. It feels like completion somehow, a circle closing." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Is that all it is? Completion? Closing a circle and walking away?" The question caught Franz off guard. I don't know what you mean." "I've had 6 years to think about you, Franz Müller. 6 years to wonder about the man who looked at me and saw a human being when everyone else saw an enemy, a prisoner, a number. 6 years to imagine what I would say if I ever saw you again." Franz's heart was pounding now. "And what did you decide? What would you say?" Sarah's expression softened. "I would say thank you, of course. I would say that you gave me back my life, and that nothing can ever repay that gift. But I would also say that connections like ours, forged in the darkest moments, tested by impossible choices, those connections are rare and precious. I'm not ready to close our circle just yet." Franz felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you write to me when you return to Germany, that we don't lose contact again, that we see what this connection might become in peace rather than in war." "Sarah," Franz said carefully, "there are many who would never understand or accept any relationship between us, given who we are, where we come from." "I know," she acknowledged, "and I'm not naive about how difficult it might be. But if we could find humanity in that detention room of all places, perhaps we can find something meaningful in this new world we're all trying to build." Franz looked out at Paris, at the city rebuilding itself after occupation, at people reclaiming their lives and creating new possibilities from the ashes of destruction. It was a metaphor for something larger, something he was only beginning to understand about his own life. "I would like to write to you," he said finally. "Very much." Sarah smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed her face and caught Franz's breath in his chest. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, he realized, a glimpse of the woman she might have been before the war, the woman she might become again in its aftermath. "Good," she said. "We'll start there." Franz returned to Munich 3 days later, carrying with him Sarah's address and a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in years. Simon had shaken his hand at the train station, not warmly but with a firmness that acknowledged what Franz had done for his sister, both during the war and now in helping reunite them. The rebuilding of Germany continued, as did Franz's work on reconstruction projects. But now his evenings were devoted to letters, long, thoughtful letters to Sarah in Paris, sharing his daily experiences, his struggles with Germany's painful reckoning with its past, his hopes for a more just future. And in return came Sarah's letters, her elegant handwriting describing her teaching work, her life with the Rosenbergs, her gradual reclaiming of joy and purpose. Through these letters, over months that stretched into years, they built something neither of them could have imagined in that detention room, a friendship based on shared values and mutual respect, a bridge between worlds that most considered unbridgeable. In 1951, Franz traveled to Paris again, this time to attend a conference on urban reconstruction. Sarah met him at the train station, and the week that followed, filled with walks along the Seine, visits to museums, long conversations over coffee, confirmed what their letters had suggested, that their connection transcended the circumstances of their first meeting, that they had each found in the other someone who understood the complexities of rebuilding a life after catastrophe. When Franz returned to Munich, their letters took on a new tone. They began to speak of the future, of possibilities, of challenges to be faced together rather than apart. The path would not be easy. There were family concerns on both sides, societal prejudices to navigate, practical questions about where and how they might build a life together. But the same courage that had led Franz to cut the fence that night, the same determination that had kept Sarah alive against all odds, now guided them toward a shared future that once would have seemed impossible. In the spring of 1953, Sarah moved to Munich to take a position teaching literature at the university. Simon remained in Paris, now working as a watchmaker like their father, but gave his blessing to his sister's decision with a maturity beyond his years. "You found life again," he told her. "Who am I to say what form that life should take?" Franz and Sarah were married that summer in a small civil ceremony, attended by Franz's family and a few close friends. It was not a union many would have predicted or immediately embraced. Franz's father, in particular, struggled to understand his son's choice. "There is too much history between your people and hers," he had argued when Franz first broached the subject. "Yes," Franz had replied simply. "That's precisely why it matters." Their life together in post-war Munich was not without challenges. There were uncomfortable silences at social gatherings, whispers behind their backs, occasional overt hostility. But there was also surprising acceptance from many quarters, particularly among the younger generation eager to build a different Germany than the one that had embraced totalitarianism. Franz continued his architecture work, specializing in public buildings, schools, libraries, community centers, designed to foster connection and democratic values. Sarah taught comparative literature, introducing her students to German, French, and Jewish writers, and the universal themes that transcended national and cultural boundaries. In 1955, they welcomed a daughter, whom they named Elise after Franz's sister. 3 years later, a son followed, named David after Sarah's father. The children grew up between cultures, learning both German and French, celebrating both Christian and Jewish holidays, inheriting a complex history, but also the promise of a more inclusive future. As the years passed and Germany slowly reclaimed its place in the community of nations, Franz and Sarah's story became known among their widening circle of friends and colleagues, not as a secret shame, but as a testament to the possibility of moral choice, even in the darkest circumstances, to the human capacity for growth and change. When their children were old enough to understand, Franz and Sarah told them the story of how they met, not the sanitized version, but the truth, with all its complexity and pain. "We want you to know," Sarah explained, "that your existence in this world comes from a moment when your father chose humanity over hatred, when he refused to participate in evil despite the risk to himself. And when your mother chose to trust despite every reason not to," Franz added, "when she found the courage to run toward an uncertain future, rather than accepting what seemed like inevitable fate." As Germany entered the 1960s, grappling still with its past, but looking increasingly toward the future, Franz and Sarah found themselves becoming somewhat reluctantly symbols of reconciliation and hope. They were invited to speak at schools and community organizations, to share their story, as an example of what was possible when people recognized each other's essential humanity across the deepest divides. They accepted these invitations selectively, protective of their privacy and aware of the complexity their story held. They were not, they insisted, a fairy tale or a simple morality play. They were two people who had made difficult choices in impossible circumstances, and who continued to make choices every day about how to live with the past while building toward a better future. In 1968, 25 years after that night in the detention room, Franz and Sarah returned to Poland together. The former labor camp was now a memorial site, part of the growing effort to ensure that the horrors of the war were not forgotten. Standing at the perimeter fence, not the same section Franz had cut that night, but similar enough to evoke powerful memories, they held hands in silence, each lost in private recollection. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah finally asked, "what would have happened if you had been someone else that night? Or if I had been someone else?" Franz considered the question carefully. "I wonder about many things," he admitted. "The randomness of it all, that of all the prisoners, you were the one brought to that room. That of all the soldiers, I was the one given those orders. That somehow in that moment we both found the courage to act against what seemed inevitable." Sarah nodded. "So much had to align perfectly for us to be standing here now, 25 years later. The slightest change and everything would be different. Or nothing would be different for the millions who didn't have that moment, that choice, that chance," Franz added soberly. They stood a while longer at the fence, bearing witness to what had happened there, to the systems of cruelty they had briefly subverted, to the lives lost and the lives forever changed. Then they turned away together, walking back toward the future they had built from that single act of courage and trust. Their story, like all true stories, had no neat ending, no point at which the narrative could be tied with a bow and declared complete. It continued to unfold through the years that followed, through the growth and marriages of their children, the birth of grandchildren, the evolution of Germany's relationship with its past, the changing dynamics of Jewish-German relations in a world still healing from profound wounds. What remained constant was the truth at the center, that in humanity's darkest hour, two people had recognized each other's essential worth and had acted accordingly. That a single moral choice, made at great risk, had created ripples that continued to spread outward through time, touching lives beyond what either of them could have imagined that snowy night in 1943. And in a world still struggling with division, hatred, and the dehumanization of those deemed other, their story offered a different possibility. Not of erasing the past or forgetting its lessons, but of building a future in which such choices would no longer be exceptional, but expected. A future in which seeing the humanity in every person would be not an act of courage, but simply the way we choose to live. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.